In this episode of the Smart City podcast, I had a really thought-provoking conversation with Katharine Willis about who the smart city is for. Katharine is an architect and associate professor at Plymouth University and initially was reluctant to get involved in the smart city space. She continues to challenge commercially driven initiatives and focus on what the people actually think about so-called smart cities. We discuss Plymouth's new Masters, Smart Urban Futures, and also a number of projects that Katharine researched about who was included and actively excluded in smart city planning and implementation around the world. We also talked about how some of the smartest places in the world are in the regional and rural areas. This episode is a bit longer than normal, but I really hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
It's the Smart City Podcast, whoa, with Smart City experts, here we go. Connecting smart technology, both big and small. Smart cities are making life better for all. Big data, emerging trends, self-driving cars and more. The Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hey Katharine, how you going?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm hoping the weather is good for you in sunny London. No, it's not London, sunny England.
Yeah, we're at two different time zones, so it's the morning here and the evening there. But yeah, we've got sunshine. We're in the southwest of the UK, which is supposedly the warmest, sunniest part of the UK. But
that's good. Good to hear. Well, let's just jump straight in and we'll start in the past. Can you tell us a bit about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, so I've been interested in like the role of technologies and cities and space for a number of years now. I trained as an architect, so my background is to be an architect, but I've always been involved in the sort of design and nature of architecture, not so much from the bricks and mortar side of things and more about how it creates experiences or spaces or changes the way we inhabit the world. So more linked to how we behave in the world. So seeing the way we inhabit space as something that we can design for. So there's a sort of the societal nature of it. And yeah, really for quite a while now, so for a good 10, 15 years, I've been looking at cities and space as a way to think through how we use technology and sort of thinking about more interesting ways in which we can sort of link how we design for spaces and how we use technologies. And so that comes out from even before there was internet. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to have not been around when there was not have internet. So we've been thinking about, from I was interested initially in like how some sort of infrastructures affect the space, so how we move through the city, and then looking at mobile phones when they came into play and how that changed how we talk to each other and how that changed how we met up and where beat were in the city. And obviously now we've gone into sort of digital and increasingly smart cities, and that becomes a whole new sort of area to look at. So the architect is sort of, for me, architecture is sort of an expanding field in this sense because it's been seen as the field that designs for stuff, for buildings and cities. To me, when we introduce technology, it becomes a field in which we look at how we design for spaces that are mixed, that use technology and some of the bricks and mortar, but that's a sort of mixed augmented or digital space that exists on multiple levels. So designing how we're having this podcast in a space might be a really interesting way to think about what space is that. I'm in a building and you're hopefully in a building, I don't know, but we're actually in another space as well. And how can we start to design for those sorts of interactions?
Yeah, definitely. So what kind of sparked your interest in this smart city space?
Well, to some extent, smart cities is a way of talking about some more recent developments with technologies and cities, and it's a term that's been used. It's quite ambiguous because it doesn't actually mean one thing. It means lots of things to lots of people. So I think it's important to think about, actually, and again, with technology, there's lots of futures and lots of presents, and we see things change. So I've been involved with technology in cities for, again, quite a while, and we've been through lots of names of things, and I think smart is one of those, and it's really interesting. It's been effectively driven by technology companies. So smarter planets was a term that IBM coined, and really became one of the ways in which smart cities emerged. And having worked in the area of sort of looking at technologies and digital technologies in cities for a long time, really, it was when smart cities came along, I was initially quite reluctant to get engaged with having a discussion, because it's quite technocentric and not really thinking about it, although it argues it's thinking about how people inhabit cities. A lot of it is selling tech to deliver solutions for cities, which I think is not the right approach. So my initial involvement was to sort of challenge it to some extent, to say, well, is the way that we're looking at smart cities right, and should we be thinking about more nuanced ways, and should we be thinking about what people actually think? I mean, smart cities has become a very citizen-centric or bottom-up. It's been discussed in that way, but a lot of the ways it's delivered is not that. So actually, my involvement in smart cities has been to look at what's smart that's not smart. How are people being smart where they might not be, someone's not labelled them smart, but also partly challenging some of the smart city initiatives that are very commercially driven, and and what that means for people in cities and the way we inhabit them and design them.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So I know you're working on a master's program at the moment. Well, I think I do. And can you tell us a bit about that? I think it's going to be on offer at the end of this year, or mid this year. Is that right?
Yeah, so we've got a new master's in what we've called Smart Urban Futures at Plymouth University, which is the university. So that's in the School of Art, Design and Architecture at Plymouth University. And the point behind the master's is we felt that there isn't any real capacity for people to learn how to design for smart cities. So this is a program to enable people to creatively address smart city challenges and work in a sort of multidisciplinary team approach in sort of what we've called design lab to come up with ways to innovate in that area. And that's sort of aimed at architects, urban designers, urban planners, but also people from a digital field, so maybe web designers or people who've been doing interaction design, or also geographers, sociologists, people probably even from law. Really, the motivation and the reason why we decided that the master's was needed was so in the field of architecture we do a lot of design, but it's often very related to sort of using technology as a tool, so CAD or BIM, and doing clever visualizations of space. That's traditionally been the way that we use technologies. And in the media fields, there's been people doing lots of exciting sort of interactions and sort of quite object-based, so you have an interaction with the screen or maybe with some object like a chair might light up if you sit on it. But we haven't really trained or given people a space to learn about how to design for cities that have technology embedded with them, and how we can also work on real world challenges around that. So we've looked and really this is the challenge for delivering smart cities. And I think it's one of the, generally if we look at smart cities internationally, there's a lot of failed projects or projects that have not delivered what they offered in terms of the promise of smart cities. And the rationale, what we think behind that is that there aren't actually people who know how to deliver them. So there are people who do data analytics in cities, and there's a lot of people who understand about how GIS and mapping have worked and how we use that to understand about census data. And then there's urban planners and urban designers, but they don't necessarily know how to treat that as a design problem and how to understand if you have, and as we move into smart cities, which, the key features are the sort of the amount and quantity and depth of data we have about a city that we can use to make decisions or to design spaces better or to allow people to participate more actively. treating that as a design challenge rather than a sort of technical challenge is really an exciting opportunity, and I think one that's been a little bit lost in the sort of gap in the field. So the Masters is aimed at letting us treat smart cities as a design challenge, that really where I think architects, urban planners and urban designers need to move much more into that space, and giving them the opportunity and giving them the technical skill set. So people will be, students will learn about how to do analytics with big data, to use programs like Unity, to sort of do some program around Internet of Things, to create interfaces around augmented and virtual reality. Those sort of technical skill sets will then mean that the opportunities are much more available to design more holistically around cities and looking at sort of citywide challenges with the ability to actually respond to them.
Yeah, cool. Will you offer it by distance by any chance?
Well, we haven't put that as an option, and actually the irony is that maybe we should. But what we're going to do is offer some online sort of aspects of the teaching. So there's an issue about how we practically accredit an online course, because that's not something that our university does specifically, sort of online. But what we're going to create is, as part of the delivery of the course, a set of the sort of some of the materials that we produce. So creating a sort of a layer which you can participate in. But yeah, maybe it's something we should look at, that we need an online version. It's definitely possible, because what the design lab approach we have will mean working with cities in a sort of partnership approach, so that we've got partnerships with the city in Plymouth, their challenges, the things they're working on as within the city around housing, around environment, around mobility. Those are going to be projects that the students will work together with on, and then identify other external partners. So maybe someone from a housing corporation, or someone who's developing some new technology around transport, for example. So to some extent, we could enable people to do that within their own city, and then report back. But yeah, it's a model we have to. I think we might start with a located approach, and then when we see how we could deliver that as an online approach, I think there's definitely a route for it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. I'm really interested to hear about the research you've been doing that you've done into marginalized communities, and how the smart city kind of provides benefit for those communities.
Well, that's part. So part of the aspect of smart cities in terms of sort of challenging it, or asking it to be sort of opening up what a smart city is from a sort of slightly closed box, which, so one of the rationale are often, if you look at almost any sort of large scale smart city project, what you'll see is a rationale which says cities are failing and are a problem, and there's too many people. There's a lot of facts and figures you'll see about smart cities, which generally say that cities are a new problem space and we need to move into them. But we actually think cities are not a problem. They are a solution, and there's lots of people, they are messy and they are complicated, and technology is not going to solve. We don't need technology to solve those solutions. We need technology to sort of work and to help people to do things they're already doing, maybe better or in different ways. And then as part of that, the key area we sort of looked at in terms of the research, because we basically did, I was part of a Newton fellowship where we did some visits to smart cities around the world, so particularly in Brazil and the UK, and looked at how they were sort of delivering their smart city projects. And what we found was that people weren't really involved, or they were in a sort of quite marginal sense. And there was also not just being not involved, but there were certain people who were being actively excluded. So as a smart city develops, it sort of becomes a sort of middle class, people who have people who are sort of already enabled become, the wealthy mobile elite are the smart city. And the people who should actually benefit, where the real potential lies, are not really, don't really have the capacity to do that. So smart enables you to connect better, to move, to not necessarily be to work outside exists to sort of work with city governance to participate in the city better. So there's a new model of governance. There's a new model of connectivity, and sort of actually, smart can be very low cost and local, to make technology in the city, in your space. So Internet of Things brings sensors and information about your city to your city, and that's really there's a lot of potential then, for example, around air pollution or transport, to make it work for you, to make a sort of shareable space, to look at shared resources. So what we want to do with this is look at who was excluded from smart cities and how could we enable them to be included. And that was a project with India, Brazil, and the UK. India has a massive, so India has a sort of a massive smart cities mission, it's called, led by Prime Minister Modi. Huge investment, very sort of Western model of have a competition where cities compete and then deliver a smart city project. Quite a lot of publicity. And what we found when we went to India was that it was excluding people. So in India, smart cities is primarily a regeneration strategy for the urban space. And in Chennai, the city we were working with an activist organisation called the Civic Consumer Action Group. And we found that they were basically sanitising the urban space, moving street traders and people with informal transport, like the tuk-tuk drivers, moving them out of the space and creating what looked like a westernised model of the urban space, which might be good, but actually a lot of people were going to lose their livelihood. And we were quite surprised to find that, because it didn't seem like that's not the promise of the smart city, but the knock-on effects are that it creates a sort of sanitized, empty, highly functionalizing, and that doesn't work for a lot of cities. That's not how they move. Waste management is one of another smart city projects, and when you manage waste in an automated way, some of the way that people inhabit that space changes. So we had an interesting conversation with the Street Traders Association. And I had a conversation with the guy who was chair of the Street Traders Association for India, who really wanted to think of another way of delivering smart cities. And I sort of said, how many members have you got? And he was like, well, 40 million. So this wasn't and it was a bit of a wake up call to the fact that we're sort of those people would be and they're very teched up, they know how to, they're very clever and they network really well. So our view was that they were much more smart in the way they use things, but they were being excluded from this process. And we found a similar thing in Brazil. So we worked with, we sort of visited an informal settlement, so what we might call a favela, and they are not part of the city infrastructure, so they don't officially have telephone cables or water pipes, but they create those for themselves. So they build it themselves. And it works quite well, but in the smart city, they don't exist. They're not on the map because they don't. As a city, the city doesn't recognise them as a formal space. So, we felt that they were smart in the way that they did things and the way they created this. They have a gambiage, that they call it, which is this informal infrastructures. They make things for themselves and then they connect to the city somehow. So some of them were connecting in different ways. Some of it was totally informal. Some of it was partly linked to the state infrastructure, but partly not. And that's really that's a smart way to use technology to sort of do it in a way that's low cost and networked and relevant to what you need to do.
So quite innovative.
Yeah, and then in London we looked again at a sort of more government-driven smart city project, and some of the way, particularly where Internet of Things was being delivered and how that works. So out of that, we came with the view that we need to empower people to find out how to use smart city technology for themselves locally in their neighbourhoods, and to do that, they needed to some extent, be involved in understanding what a smart city is. So we've got a first step of like, there's an argument made in academia is if you're going to be part of the smart city, we're making smart citizens, and I don't think a lot of people are aware that they're being made smart and do they want to? So, I did a talk at a secondary school in London, and I talked about smart cities, and these are kids who really, really good with a lot of tech, probably do a lot of gaming, have a phone, probably a fairly high spec smartphone, but no one's told them what smart cities are. So if we're going to have a smart city, we need to have people who understand for them how they can be and have the ability to use the technology in a way that that they can do themselves. So how can can we use an air quality sensor, or how do we interact with that data?
Definitely. So what are some of the examples of the best and the worst approaches to smart cities in the UK?
In the UK. I think the best are the ones. So there's some interesting examples about where people. So one of the projects that I found really interesting was so we had a conference as part of our Who's Right to the Smart City Network, and we had a presentation by a farm in the east of London called Spitalfields City Farm. And there was a project led by an academic called Sarah Heitlinger, who worked with the City Farm on a project called Connected Seeds. And that was Internet of Things, but for local food production. And it was about how people could look at the seed production and the information about the farm in a way that they could sort of get data about what the soil temperature was, how the seeds were going. And to me, those are really interesting ways about it, where the technology isn't driving things. It just creates another level to what people are doing in terms of creating shared resources and providing for themselves. Spitalfields is in Whitechapel area of London, and it's a fairly poor area, very mixed nationalities, so very multicultural. So a lot of people with English as a second language. So, but where food is one of the ways in which they come together and produce something for themselves, to create their own space. So I think that's a really interesting project. There's some interesting work coming out of Oxford, where they're doing they have a flood network using Internet of Things, again low cost sensors, where people can sort of manage the water levels and see how they're going for themselves in real time. In Plymouth, we've had some really interesting projects, and this has been one of the motivations around starting the new masters, because there's a lot of bottom-up driven smart city projects being developed in Plymouth. There's a lot of potential within the city and a lot of room to take that approach. So I've worked together with a project led by a social entrepreneur called Priya Prakash with Design for Social Change. And that project called Changeify, Smarter Streets, was to look at ways in which people could change the street space and act upon it in a much more participatory way and a much more joined up way with the city. So if you think about projects like Fix My Street or those sorts of neighbourhood projects which allow people to report problems in the city and link them directly to the city rather than a sort of more formal process, this was sort of extending that but making it into a sort of closed feedback loop with the city, so that you could create, and so basically you could move around the city with an app and report issues you could see. The city would then respond to those directly, and then you'd get you could sort of create this sort of space of deciding how to change things. So that could move from literally reporting a street lamp that's broken to going, well, actually, we need to design this space differently, and how could we do that? And opening up a conversation in that space there, and then looking how to resource it. So another really interesting project that's been happening in Plymouth, and I think crowdfunding as a way to deliver smart city projects is really exciting, is there's a Crowdfund Plymouth, where people from across the city can propose projects for their local communities that have benefit, and they pitch them on the crowdfunding platform. And if they fit a sort of core set of criteria around what the city is trying to achieve with its own local plan, they can get match funding. So there's projects for sort of developing community spaces and local parks and children's playgrounds that they use the crowdfunding approach, and they've then got buy-in from citizens, and then the city matches, and they've funded over £1 million worth of projects in the city through that approach.
Oh, wow.
And then the final one, which we've also been led in Plymouth, and I think has a lot of potential, is an initiative called Data Play, which is rather than so there's a lot of approach around open data and the role of data in the city that have sort of created platforms which people can access. And I think there's a challenge about people being empowered to create data and use data for themselves that's in a way that's relevant to them. So Data Play takes city challenges such as housing, environment, transport, and opens up a sort of a weekend of play, discussion, and prototyping around open data, and seeing what we could do with it. And that's been quite successful, and is now leading to sort of a next set of projects, which is creating specific ways about using open data within the city. So, for example, we're having a conversation with the Parks Department about how they could create sort of networks of sensors within their parks that shows how the parks are used, so that people can participate in them better. They can see maybe where the trees are, and how they're getting maintained. So linking up with how the city's maintaining, but also how people are using the space in a way that makes it uses data in a sort of joined up way, also looking at sort of health and well-being outcomes.
Yeah, cool.
And I was going to pick up on a poor example. The main one I didn't is that they're generally the ones that have failed because they've promised things that they can't deliver. So there's a lot of smart cities projects that promise a lot of large scale, sort of fairly quick change in the city, and that's just not very realistic in any. And that's not the smart city, but that's not realistic. So technology as a fix for a problem that we have is a poor way to think about it, and I think that's generally where we've seen where things have failed.
Yeah, definitely. So how do you think that pilots of smart technology should work with the community and the citizens to implement their projects?
Well, the key thing is there's quite a few examples of this where we get a sort of, again, this solution-based approach to technology where we'll come with a solution and try and find a problem within the city to fix. So, transport might be a problem, and we'll try and fix it with technology. And to some extent, transport has been one of the most successful ways, like using joined up transport data to sort of understand people's journey times has been really, really works. But when working with the city, we should start with what the city wants to do. A lot of smart cities lack the historical context, the understanding of what's gone before. They introduce this, magic wand that's going to somehow solve long-term complex problems. So let's start with what the city wants to do in a positive way. What it needs to, not the problems, but the things that also work, and build on those, and work with, instead of looking at the technology and where it can have a quick win, look at the most challenging areas. So where are the communities that would benefit most from this, and work with them. And to some extent that starts with empowerment. So it starts with letting people understand how to use smart. So there's been an interesting initiative we've been working called Things Camp with ODI Devon, so Open Data Institute Devon. That's part of the larger Open Data Institute. Can we look at how Internet Things, get kids to program Arduino, use Raspberry Pis? How could we start to use those in communities? to do much more sort of local hackable type things where they can fix it for themselves and not need someone who's technical capacity, because smart cities need maintenance. In 2 years' time, they'll be the cost. A lot of the problem we have is that you introduce this technology and in 2 years you've got to pay to maintain it, and the money's not there anymore. So that's not very sustainable. So working with cities, I think looking at low cost, citizen-driven challenges enabled through the city governance system, but working with existing structures, so with communities or groups who are already sort of working in the space of delivering change. That's part of a sort of more sustainable, I think, approach to smart cities. So, what do people want to do? And then looking at what the potential is to use those smart technologies to enable that.
Yeah, cool. So how do you think we can better integrate across the disciplines, so government, academia, industries, community groups, like all those different areas? We're all involved in the smart city. So how can we better integrate?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting potentials and also challenges within smart city. It really does involve people from a whole range of areas, and so it seems to me one of the key outcomes of smart cities is getting different parts of different people who participate in cities to see it as a joined up thing and to recognise that one area impacts on the other. So that learning process is interesting. That the smart city is a sort of connected approach. It sees you look at one area and it connects to another, and you sort of reveal things. So that's a challenge that smart cities doesn't have in itself. It's a challenge anyway of people working together. I think the one of the key ways it's being done through smart cities is a sort of living lab approach. So taking pilot neighbourhoods and just trying to work on a scale that's manageable, because citywide it's quite hard. But also the key thing is if you've got people who don't have capacity to understand how technology, what the potentials are, then I think that's the rationale for creating the new masters in smart urban futures, is to enable people to have both the capacity around what smart cities in terms of technology means, but also in terms of the urban space and the placemaking. So the joined up approach, I think living labs working with communities at a sort of manageable scale to test this. What a lot of the way this is making change, and it's quite so, and taking time to do that. Not rushing things. A sort of slow smart city is probably going to be more realistic. Everything seems to move quite fast, and I think that ideally, there's a need to recognise this through some sort of funding mechanism that's not short term. There is some cost. There are costs involved with this. It isn't. You can't deliver it, and a lot of it's actually being delivered through research type funding, which is sort of great, but it runs out. And how do we make sustainable change? So how do we fund? How do we fund these sort of technologies within technological change? We're getting people to work together. I think when you're interdisciplinary, it's like getting a common language and understanding what it means. One of the challenges with smart city is like when you ask anybody about it, there's a different answer depending on who you speak to. So just establishing a common ground initially about what you all agree smart is and what you want to achieve with it is a really good approach. So setting a common language.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think the UK already are or can become leaders in the smart city space?
Well, my view is that what we want. The way that smart cities has been sort of pitched is this sort of business competitive, this marketing of cities internationally. And that seems to me to be fundamentally flawed. So why would that? I mean, I can see that, and that's a way of attracting investment. So if smart cities is an investment strategy, then yes, UK is innovating. But to me personally, and in terms of the area we work in, when we work with communities, we see that in a sort of longer term sense and and a more local sense. And that particularly if you move, so one of the key challenges with smart cities is it's been sort of leading large-scale, sort of highly networked cities, so London, New York, Amsterdam, Barcelona. Those cities work at a global scale, and really the benefit with smart cities should be at a local or regional scale, and also beyond the city. What about the rural? Interestingly, one of the most technologically developed environments that we see is farms. So farms are like one of the most smart spaces that we have at the moment. They're incredibly technologically driven. So we haven't really understood that. So I think that's a little bit, I'm sort of deliberately avoiding your question, because does it matter? It matters to cities in terms of getting money in. But I think does it matter if it matters to thinking about a longer term strategy about how technology and data and Internet of Things are affecting how we govern, inhabit, and sort of design cities and the spaces we live in. Actually, we need to think about what challenges, what are the challenges we have to deal with, particularly around climate change and around integration, and those are the areas that are our competition. That's when the end where benefit will come to communities. So really, I think that, and so moving from this sort of smart city as a competition that we're going to win because we're the best seems to me to be like not particularly useful, and it helps to hear stories and to learn about what best practice is. That's obviously great, but this competitiveness is I think not really sustainable, and maybe not really whether. So again, when we've worked with local communities, that's not they don't benefit from city competitiveness, and particularly it doesn't work at a local scale.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting kind of view to bring to it. I really like it because particularly the regional areas is one of the areas that I'm really passionate about. So yeah, no, I really appreciate that viewpoint.
And the regional, we've like there are like, I don't know how many large scale global cities there are in the world, but they're limited and they're doing quite well actually. They're really not. They have a lot of and actually the regional cities, there's a lot of them. They're struggling with resources. Globally, those are the cities that are probably the poorer neighbours. And actually, if we think about if technology is going to be a benefit to society, that's where the benefit should be. So we should really be concentrating. Again, I think this is because the smart city agenda has generally been led by a group of actors who have interests that are not necessarily societal interests. They may argue that, and there's a need to reclaim. So one of the reasons we called our network was "Who's right to the city? Who's right to the smart city?" So who's the smart city for? And we get told who it's for, but I think there's a need to reclaim it for ourselves and at a regional level and a local level. Doing that involves getting beyond this sort of narrative of the sort of market-driven smart city and looking at it in a much more sort of holistic and sort of citizen-driven level.
Yeah, cool. So what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about at the moment?
Well, I think that people are talking about a lot of things. So the trends it's more a case of like, how do we do it? Because it's all very well to talk about Internet of Things and sensors and networks, but the things we're not talking about is what we do when it breaks down. How do we pay for it after the first few years? Who maintains it? What happens when it gets dirty and breaks? How can I use it in my space? So I think there's a sort of there's a glossiness that we've sort of need to get beyond, and to be a more sort of sensible smart city. But in terms of technology, there's some really interesting. The spaces I'm thinking about are the ones where like around the use, like how what's interesting, for example, around Internet of Things is that we can involve lots of different things in our world. And people, we use technology as people, but there's projects that look at the role of nature or food or objects within our environment. So what happens when we can speak to trees? I think those sorts of the AI, the role of AI in how we see the sort of physical and the material world around us is really interesting. That there's the role of emotional. So what we can do now is we can run sentiment analysis on data sets, so we can understand how people feel about things, and that means how they feel about cities. So the sort of emotional, the affective use of computing cities are places that people have feelings about. And if you're, as an architect, places are experiential, how we make sense of the world around us by the relationships we create with it. And technology can start to be a little bit more nuanced in understanding that and sort of making that visible to us, specifically around other people. So how do other people feel, and how does that affect us? So that is being used for advertising, for example. So advertisers know whether you're in a good mood, and they might want to sell you. They'll promote a shop to you nearby if you are, because they'll know from your Facebook feed. But how do we move away from that and to letting people manage that for themselves and do that in a more participatory way? And then obviously the thing people are talking about is different ways of governing cities through smart technologies. So the crowdfunding, the ways in which people can sort of create their own publics within the city, new commons. I think we've sort of started on that route, but there's a lot of room to go in terms of sort of people reporting in real time. So predictive governance, it sort of changes the nature of the planning of cities, from cities where we planned them and we consulted and then we told people what we're going to do, to people planning cities and then asking the city how they're going to deliver it or how they can help deliver it with them. That's really interesting, and that's a space that there's quite a lot of particularly, I don't know, in terms of resources, where the regional cities don't have massive resources, but people want to do stuff, then there's room for that. So, and then obviously around energy use, looking at how we can do behaviour change around energy use and climate change, and make it that's a sort of area. There's lots of potential to sort of get people away from, driving a lot and using a lot of energy in their home, potentially, to being more joined up in understanding how they can make behaviour change for themselves that's relevant to them.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, this has been such a great conversation. I've learnt so much, and I've learnt so much, but also, very thought-provoking, thinking about, the regional areas and like the benefits, and who is the smart city going to benefit, and it should benefit everybody, but what that focus is. It's been really interesting. I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
So I'm on Twitter. So my Twitter is TrolleyTweet, TrolleyTweet. You can look at the Smart Urban Futures if you go to the University of Plymouth, so plymouth.ac.uk, and look for Smart Urban Futures. They can connect to that master's programme. So there's email as well. We have Facebook pages for some of those things if people want to search through that.
Yeah, cool. I can put it all in the show notes. You can give me the links and I'll put it all there. So, yeah. Very good. Well, thanks so much for talking with me, Katharine. It's been really great. And, I really hope we can talk again soon.
I would be interested to know what you're doing in Australia, and whether this resonates with projects that you're involved in, because I know this is something you're doing the podcast, but obviously you're involved in this space as a in terms of the work you do as well. So
yeah, definitely. No, let's have a chat about that. It'd be really cool. And hopefully we can get a master's program online so I can sit at home and learn how to code and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, thank you, Zoe.
It's the Smart City Podcast. Whoa.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart City Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes can be found at thesmartcitypodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments for me or any of my guests, connect with me via email, zoe@thesmartcitypodcast.com, or via the socials. I'm on Twitter and Facebook @SmartCityPod. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.